I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
What happened inside the royal residence that night was never meant to reach the outside world. A sealed meeting between Charles and Camilla behind closed doors was believed to be routine, but what unfolded instead became the most sensitive breach inside the monarchy in years. No aides, no advisors, no witnesses, only silence, raised emotions, and a decision that would quietly fracture trust at the highest level of the palace hierarchy inside Clarence House. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The corridor outside the private chamber was cleared with unusual urgency, staff instructed to remain away for hours, a detail that immediately signaled something far beyond routine royal discussion. Inside, the atmosphere was already fractured before a single word was spoken, as Charles entered with visible tension, carrying the weight of institutional pressure that rarely surfaced in public view. Camilla did not meet his eyes at first, her silence reflecting not absence of feeling, but accumulation of unresolved strain that had been building long before this moment. The meeting was not about ceremony or scheduling, it was about legacy, influence, and the fragile balance of trust that had begun to shift between them in ways neither could ignore. Charles moved through the conversation with controlled restraint, but every sentence revealed how deeply the issue of royal legacy messaging the public narrative, shaping how the monarchy is perceived across generations, had become a source of internal disagreement. Camilla responded carefully, yet firmly, challenging the assumption that influence inside the institution could be separated from personal trust. The tension between them did not erupt loudly, it tightened slowly, becoming heavier with every pause, every unfinished thought, every refusal to fully concede. A documented exchange, later described in internal palace notes as a private alignment breakdown, would confirm that both figures, for the first time in years, openly reconsidered how their roles should be presented to the public and to the institution itself. The turning point came after a prolonged silence, when both agreed in principle to adjust and restructure their public roles, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a practical response to the strain that had been building behind closed doors. The decision was not celebrated, it was endured. A handwritten draft document was placed on the table, outlining the proposed changes in careful, restrained language, yet neither Charles nor Camilla reached for a pen. The paper remained unsigned, suspended in a moment that felt heavier than agreement or refusal, as if the monarchy itself was hesitating alongside them. A junior aide, later providing a documented account of the night, noticed something unsettling minutes after the meeting ended. A sealed folder quietly removed from the room without explanation, carried away without acknowledgement. That single movement suggested not closure, but containment, as if what had just been decided was already being controlled before it could fully surface. But what began as a private exchange between two figures would soon unravel into a story shaped long before that night even began. To understand what unfolded behind those closed doors, one must first understand the emotional weight carried by both figures long before they ever stepped into the same room inside Clarence House. Nothing about that night began in isolation. Every word, every silence, every hesitation was shaped by years of scrutiny, expectation, and pressure that never fully left the walls of the institution. Charles carried the relentless strain of transition, an ongoing demand to stabilize the monarchy while constantly being measured against its past. At the same time, Camilla moved through a world that never stopped interpreting her presence, where every action was filtered through perception rather than intent. Charles entered that phase of his reign under constant weight, not just as a monarch, but as a figure expected to embody continuity while quietly reshaping the future. The pressure of public expectation fatigue followed him into every decision, turning even private choices into matters of symbolic consequence. Camilla, meanwhile, faced a different kind of strain, an internal isolation that grew not from absence of role, but from the constant recalibration of how her role was understood inside palace influence structures. She remained present, visible, and active, yet increasingly aware that presence did not always translate into shared authority or emotional alignment. The hook of stability that once defined their partnership began to bend under competing responsibilities. Charles found himself torn between duty to the crown and personal loyalty to Camilla, a tension that rarely found expression but often shaped his restraint. Camilla, in contrast, felt the slow erosion of influence within the institutional framework around her, where decisions were discussed but not always shared in full context. Each carried loyalty, yet that loyalty was being tested in different directions, one toward structure, the other toward recognition within that structure. Inside their private exchanges, a subtle but undeniable disagreement began forming over control of narrative decisions within the royal household, the structured management of how royal actions are publicly presented and interpreted. It was never framed as conflict in the traditional sense, but as differing instincts about how transparency, authority, and messaging should intersect in a modern monarchy. Charles leaned toward containment and strategic clarity, while Camilla pushed toward acknowledgement of lived reality, even when it complicated presentation. Neither position was absolute, but together, they created friction that neither had fully resolved in earlier conversations. That unresolved tension did not appear suddenly. It accumulated in fragments, brief disagreements, unspoken frustrations, and moments where decisions moved forward without full emotional alignment between them. A documented reference later made by a senior courtier during a confidential briefing pointed to a previously unseen communication file connected to that night, an internal exchange record that suggested certain concerns had been raised long before the meeting ever took place. Its existence implied that what unfolded was not spontaneous, but the continuation of something already in motion beneath the surface of palace order. Yet the roots of this tension stretch far deeper than that single night inside Clarence House. Long before the sealed conversation inside Clarence House ever took place, something quieter, but far more consequential, had already shifted the emotional ground beneath it. It did not happen in public, and it was never officially recorded as significant, yet it reshaped how trust would later move between Charles and Camilla in ways neither could fully reverse. The night in question unfolded during a formal royal engagement dinner at Sandringham House, where appearances were maintained with precision, but beneath the surface, tension had already begun to accumulate. Long before the secret meeting was held, a single night altered the emotional foundation of everything that followed. A private royal engagement dinner at Sandringham became the turning point no one officially acknowledged, yet everyone later remembered. A single conversation, overheard in passing, changed how trust moved between Charles and Camilla. From that moment forward, nothing in their private communication remained entirely untouched by doubt. The dinner itself was structured, formal, and outwardly seamless, bringing together senior household figures and select advisors in a setting designed to reinforce unity and continuity. Charles and Camilla appeared aligned in public perception, presenting the stability expected of their positions. Yet beneath that presentation, subtle fractures were already forming in how decisions were being perceived internally. The issue did not emerge loudly at first. It surfaced through a pointed question about influence over scheduling decisions, particularly how certain engagements were being prioritized and approved without broader consultation. That question did not carry accusation in tone, but it landed heavily, exposing a sensitivity around control that had not previously been spoken aloud in such a setting. Camilla's response was measured, but the moment created an immediate shift in the room's emotional temperature. Charles reacted with a cold restraint that masked irritation more than neutrality, especially when the discussion edged toward the boundaries of authority within private chambers, the internal decision-making spaces where royal planning and access are coordinated away from public visibility. The phrase itself became charged, not because of how it was said, but because of what it implied, that influence might be perceived as uneven or unexamined. Somewhere near the edge of the gathering, a staff member unintentionally overheard fragments of a private exchange, words spoken too quietly to be meant for anyone beyond the immediate conversation. Among them, One phrase stood out with unsettling clarity: control of decisions. It was not repeated, not clarified, but it lingered long after the moment passed, embedding itself into internal awareness as something uncomfortably unresolved. That overheard fragment would later be identified as the unseen trigger that fed directly into the tensions culminating in the Clarence House meeting, reshaping how every subsequent interaction was interpreted by those closest to them. Even more unsettling, that same conversation was briefly captured in internal notes recorded by household staff, only to disappear later from archival records without explanation. Its absence created more suspicion than its presence ever could have, suggesting not deletion of content alone, but removal of context that others were never meant to fully reconstruct. And by the time they met again in private, the damage had already begun shaping every word they would say. Inside the sealed chamber of Clarence House, the air felt stripped of ceremony, as if the weight of years had been compressed into a single unbroken silence. No aides stood outside, no recorders captured a word, and no protocol softened what was about to unfold. Charles entered without hesitation, but the tension in his posture revealed a pressure he had carried long before crossing the threshold. Across from him, Camilla was already seated, composed but distant, her silence carrying the kind of exhaustion that does not ask for attention, but demands to be felt. The door closed, and in that sound alone, the entire tone of the monarchy's internal world seemed to shift. Inside the closed room, there were no titles, no protocols, and no protective distance between two people facing the weight of everything unsaid. The atmosphere tightened the moment Charles closed the door behind him. Camilla was already seated, her expression unreadable. What followed was not a discussion, it was a confrontation, shaped by years of expectation, loyalty, and emotional exhaustion that finally broke through restraint. The meeting did not begin with greeting or easing into formality. It began with pressure already in motion, as if both understood that this moment had been building long before they entered the room. Charles spoke first, his frustration not loud but precise, centered on what he perceived as a gradual erosion of control within private advisory channels, the internal communication networks that shape decisions before they ever reach public or formal approval. To him, it was not just administrative drift, it was a structural concern that touched the core of authority itself. Camilla listened without interruption, her restraint holding steady on the surface, yet beneath it lay a history of strain that had rarely been acknowledged out loud. She did not defend quickly, nor did she retreat. Instead, she absorbed each word with the awareness that this was not only about process, but perception. As the conversation deepened, the emotional distance between them narrowed into something sharper, less avoidable. Charles's tone carried the weight of accumulated frustration, while Camilla's responses revealed a quieter, more personal fatigue, one shaped by long-standing pressure to remain composed while constantly being interpreted rather than understood. The exchange did not escalate into chaos, it tightened into control, each sentence measured, each pause heavier than the last. Then came the decisive moment. Without speaking, Charles pushed a document across the table. The movement was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably final in tone, as if the paper itself carried the unresolved direction of everything they had not said aloud. Camilla looked at it, but did not immediately respond. The hesitation that followed was not uncertainty alone. It was recognition that the balance of the conversation had shifted beyond easy repair. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The silence expanded until it felt like a third presence in the room, filling every space where explanation might have been. Then, before anything could resolve, the door opened slightly, and a courtier stepped in, brief and careful, interrupting without fully breaking the tension already formed between them. No words inside the room followed immediately, and no direction was given to continue or conclude. The interruption did not end the conversation, it suspended it in a state of unresolved pressure that neither side could fully reclaim. But the true power behind what unfolded in that room extended far beyond the two people inside it. In the shadowed structure of royal power inside Clarence House, nothing exists in isolation. Every decision is filtered through an unseen architecture of influence advisors, private secretaries, and internal gatekeepers who shape outcomes long before they ever reach public awareness. Within this controlled environment, Charles does not act alone, even when he appears to. And beside him, Camilla navigates a space where presence does not always guarantee influence, and silence often carries more authority than speech. Behind every royal decision lies an invisible architecture of influence advisors, private secretaries, and internal gatekeepers who shape outcomes without ever appearing in public view. The secret meeting between Charles and Camilla was not just a personal exchange. It was a moment where that invisible system tightened around them. Every pause, every hesitation, carried weight far beyond emotion. It reflected control, hierarchy, and carefully managed authority. Inside the palace machinery, senior advisors begin to track subtle but meaningful shifts in internal communication patterns, noticing how messages linked to Charles's decision-making flow are being redirected, slowed, or reframed before reaching final approval stages. These changes are not dramatic enough to trigger alarm individually, but together, they suggest a recalibration of influence inside the household structure. Charles, meanwhile, feels that pressure in real time not as open resistance, but as competing advisory voices converging around him, each carrying institutional intent that subtly shapes the boundaries of his own authority. Camilla experiences a different pressure entirely. Her informal influence, once fluid within internal discussions, now feels narrowed, as if the pathways she once moved through effortlessly are becoming less responsive, less direct, more carefully filtered than before. The emotional weight of the meeting between them begins to echo through this system almost immediately. A senior aide, reviewing internal documentation trails connected to that night, flags irregular handling of certain records linked to the private exchange. The concern is not about content alone, but about movement, how information was processed, who accessed it, and why certain procedural steps appear incomplete or unusually compressed. That observation triggers a broader unease within administrative layers, where questions begin forming about whether internal communication integrity has been fully preserved. As scrutiny deepens, concerns emerge not only about structure, but about exposure, whether fragments of that private meeting may have slipped into unintended channels within the household system. No accusation is made openly, but the atmosphere shifts. Caution replaces routine, and observation becomes more precise. Within this tightening framework, every document connected to the meeting gains significance beyond its original intent. Then, a confidential file linked directly to the exchange between Charles and Camilla is quietly marked for restricted review, elevating it beyond standard internal access protocols. The marking does not explain itself, but its presence signals that the matter has moved into a category of controlled sensitivity, where only select eyes are permitted to trace its contents or origin. That single designation changes the rhythm of internal operations, turning what seemed like an isolated private conversation into something far more structurally sensitive within the palace hierarchy. And as control tightened in the background, the consequences of that night began to surface in unexpected ways. When silence breaks inside the palace, it rarely does so loudly. Instead, it appears as subtle changes in tone, unexpected absences, and unreadable expressions behind closed doors. In the days following the secret meeting inside Clarence House, those closest to Charles and Camilla began to notice shifts, too small to name, but too significant to ignore. Something had changed, and it was already reshaping the emotional structure of the household from within, even before any official acknowledgement could be imagined. Inside this quiet aftermath, internal schedules begin adjusting without public explanation, not as disruption, but as recalibration of rhythm and priority. Meetings shift, timings compress, and previously stable engagements are subtly reorganized in ways that only those within the system can fully recognize. Senior staff begin observing a new distance forming between Charles and Camilla, not visible in public appearances, but unmistakable in private coordination. Their communication patterns lose their earlier ease. responses become shorter, exchanges more structured, and moments of informal alignment begin to disappear altogether. It is not conflict that defines this shift, but absence and emotional space where connection once operated freely. Charles, increasingly absorbed in private work sessions, withdraws from informal discussion channels that once allowed fluid exchange of thought and reassurance. His focus tightens around institutional priorities, and even when present, he feels less accessible than before, as if every conversation now carries the weight of consequence rather than familiarity. Camilla, meanwhile, is seen more frequently alone after formal engagements, seated in quiet reflection that staff struggle to interpret without speculation. Her silence is not detachment, but processing an internal response to changes that have not been directly explained, yet are clearly being felt in every altered interaction around her. Within secured storage areas of the palace system, a courtier notices something unexpected. Documents previously linked to internal discussions surrounding the recent Clarence House meeting are no longer in their expected location. The removal is not publicly recorded, nor is it immediately explained, but its absence introduces a deeper layer of uncertainty. In environments where documentation equals clarity, missing files create space for interpretation, and interpretation quickly becomes speculation. Conversations begin forming in low tones among senior staff, each attempting to understand whether these shifts represent closure or escalation of something still unfolding beneath the surface. A trusted aide, recognizing the growing sensitivity of the situation, begins preparing a confidential briefing intended for higher advisory review. The act itself is careful, deliberate, and quiet, reflecting the awareness that even internal summaries now carry heightened significance. Nothing is said openly about the original meeting, yet everything being documented points back toward it, as though the emotional residue of that night has begun influencing every operational layer around it. But the most unexpected shift would occur when two people met again without palace structure between them. Away from formal chambers and structured meetings, the weight of everything unsaid finally pushed Charles and Camilla into a rare space, where titles no longer protected emotion and roles no longer softened truth inside Clarence House. No advisors stood nearby, no documents shaped the conversation, and no institutional framing dictated how they were meant to speak to each other. What remained was only presence raw, unfiltered, and impossible to manage through protocol. Both entered carrying the residue of recent tension, aware that something fundamental between them had already shifted beyond easy repair. Away from formal chambers and structured meetings, Charles and Camilla found themselves in a rare private moment that carried no institutional framing. No advisors stood nearby, no documents lay between them, only conversation remained. What was said in that moment was not planned, not filtered, and not mediated by royal expectation. It was direct, fragile, and shaped entirely by everything that had already been left unresolved. The room they chose was not ceremonial, not designed for decision-making, but for quiet withdrawal, yet even there, the monarchy's pressure followed them in invisible form. Charles spoke first, not with authority, but with exhaustion, carried from layers of responsibility that had accumulated far beyond public perception. He acknowledged, without theatrical emphasis, that the weight of decision-making inside the institution had begun to blur into emotional fatigue, where every choice carried not only consequence, but internal cost. Camilla listened without interruption, but her stillness reflected something deeper than patience. It reflected distance, a growing sense that her place within internal influence structures was no longer as fluid or responsive as it once had been. When Camilla finally responded, her words did not challenge authority. They revealed separation. She expressed how increasingly removed she felt from the channels where decisions were shaped and understood, before becoming visible action. It was not exclusion in a formal sense, but something more subtle, the feeling of being adjacent to influence rather than inside it. That acknowledgement changed the atmosphere immediately, not through disagreement, but through recognition of divergence that neither had fully named until now. Charles did not answer at once. A silence formed, stretching longer than comfort allowed. heavy enough to suggest that both understood what had just been exposed could not be easily undone. In that pause, something unspoken solidified between them. It was not conflict, but alignment of realization, that their public alignment no longer mirrored their private experience, and that the distance between role and reality had widened beyond what casual adjustment could fix. Neither attempted to close that gap with reassurance, because reassurance no longer matched what they both knew internally to be true. The structure of their shared position had begun to move in different directions, even while standing in the same place. When the conversation resumed, it did so with restraint rather than resolution. There was no dramatic conclusion, no attempt to restore what had already shifted. Instead, a quiet understanding formed an agreement, not spoken with ceremony, but accepted through silence, that something within their internal direction had permanently changed. It was not declared, not recorded, not announced, yet it carried the weight of finality, in the way neither sought to reverse what had been acknowledged. And while the palace remained silent, the outside world was about to react in ways no one inside could control. When whispers inside the palace finally reached the outside world, they did not arrive as whispers at all. They erupted as headlines, breaking news banners, and urgent commentary that spread faster than the institution could respond. Inside Clarence House, what had been a sealed exchange between Charles and Camilla was now no longer contained by silence or discretion. Every fragment of interpretation began shaping a public narrative that neither control nor clarification could fully contain. When whispers inside the palace finally reached the outside world, they did not arrive as whispers at all. They emerged as headlines, broadcasts, and sudden public speculation that gripped attention instantly. The secret meeting between Charles and Camilla became the center of intense interpretation, with every detail dissected. And in that moment, the monarchy once again found itself balancing private truth against public perception. Front pages across major newspapers pivoted immediately toward the developing narrative, framing the situation as evidence of internal tension within the royal household. Analysts and commentators, relying on leaked references and fragmented internal signals, began constructing competing interpretations of what the Clarence House meeting represented. Some described it as a moment of necessary recalibration inside the monarchy's internal structure, while others saw it as a sign of deeper strain emerging between duty and personal alignment. The lack of official detail did not slow speculation, it intensified it, allowing every gap in information to be filled with assumption. Emotional reaction quickly split into contrasting directions. Royal commentators, speaking across televised panels and radio discussions, framed the situation as a potential fracture in internal cohesion, emphasizing how rare such visible ambiguity had become within modern royal operations. Public response followed a similar divide. Some voices expressed concern over stability and continuity, while others interpreted the developments with cautious sympathy, recognizing the human strain behind institutional expectation. The monarchy, once again, stood at the center of interpretation rather than control. During evening coverage, a live broadcaster referenced what was described as a sealed palace conversation, a phrase that immediately took on symbolic weight far beyond its original context. Without additional detail, the phrase became a focal point for speculation, suggesting secrecy, sensitivity, and unresolved internal tension within the highest levels of royal communication. At the same time, repeated images of palace gates circulated across media platforms, turning physical architecture into symbolic representation of distance, control, and separation between institution and public perception. Each visual reinforced the idea that something significant was unfolding behind closed doors, even if nothing could be formally confirmed. Journalists intensified their focus, waiting for an official clarification that never fully arrived. The absence of response became its own form of communication, feeding further analysis and prolonging uncertainty. Every hour without explanation added weight to the story, allowing interpretation to replace confirmation in the public consciousness. The silence from within the institution did not weaken attention, it magnified it, turning speculation into narrative momentum that moved independently of official structure. But in the silence that followed the storm, the true meaning of everything finally became clear. The silence inside Clarence House did not feel empty, it felt loaded, as if every word that could have been spoken was still hanging in the air, unresolved and unclaimed. Charles and Camilla no longer stood as distant symbols of institution and duty in that moment, but as two individuals forced to confront the emotional cost of everything their roles had buried for years. Nothing about the room protected them now. No titles softened the tension. No structure absorbed the weight. Only truth remained, stripped of ceremony and impossible to ignore. The atmosphere tightened further, as both understood that what they were about to say would not remain contained within the boundaries of formality. Charles spoke first, not with command, but with exhaustion, shaped by years of pressure that had never fully left him, even in moments of public success. The burden of decision-making inside the monarchy had become something heavier than responsibility. It had become constant internal negotiation between duty and consequence. He admitted, without dramatization, that the institution had begun to demand more than structure could comfortably hold, leaving little space for emotional clarity or personal alignment. Camilla listened, not as a figure positioned beside power, but as someone gradually recognizing how far removed she had become from the mechanisms that once included her voice in meaningful ways. When she finally responded, her words did not seek to challenge or correct, they revealed distance that had already formed quietly over time. She described the growing sense of being positioned near influence rather than within it, observing decisions as they formed rather than shaping them in real time. It was not rejection, nor exclusion in a formal sense, but something more subtle and more destabilizing. The realization that proximity no longer guaranteed participation. That truth did not fracture the conversation, it deepened it, forcing both to acknowledge what neither had previously articulated so directly. Charles did not interrupt. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle, and in that silence, the weight of understanding became unavoidable. What formed between them in that pause was not disagreement, but recognition, a quiet alignment that their public unity no longer reflected their private reality, and that the space between perception and lived experience had widened beyond easy repair. Neither attempted to soften it, because neither could pretend it was temporary. The structure they had once navigated together was no longer moving in sync, even if they remained physically within the same system. The realization did not arrive as collapse, but as clarity sharp, uncomfortable, and irreversible in its honesty. When they spoke again, it was no longer to resolve, but to acknowledge. There was no return to previous equilibrium, no attempt to reconstruct what had already shifted internally. Instead, what emerged was an unspoken understanding that the direction of their shared path had changed permanently, even if nothing official would ever record that moment. It remained private, unannounced, and unmarked, but its consequences had already begun forming beneath every future interaction. And while the palace remained silent, the outside world was about to react in ways no one inside could control.